Rick
Okay.
Doblin, thank you so much for joining us on our Peace Inside Live conversations. We appreciate it.
Yeah, I got a few seconds there of that relaxation. That was very
Good.
delicious.
You deserve it. Do you ever relax?
Well, this is pretty relaxing, this kind of work. And um, yeah, I guess I feel more relaxed by becoming more hopeful and seeing more progress. And
Mm-hmm.
so, but I also I was planning to hang out later tonight and watch movies with my two daughters who are home,
Beautiful.
quarantine with my wife. Yeah.
Well, we appreciate you being here today. I'm sure many of you know Rick. You probably follow Maps. For those of you who don't, maybe you're new to this or you're coming in through other communities because you were interested and curious about psychedelics. Well, Rick Doblin is the founder and executive director of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. It's known as MAPS. And I could go through your entire background, but you've been really leading the way for FDA to approve psychedelics and psychedelic therapy. And so once again, for everyone joining, you might not have heard, but if you have questions, leave the questions or comments in the chat, or you put up your hand if you also have a question so I can see who's wanting to ask questions, or I'll just bring you up if I see something in the chat. So that's kind of like little guidelines here. So Rick, I guess to get going, like what inspired you to start MAPS and how has it evolved until now?
Well, what inspired me to start MAPS was, uh, I would say, the most amazing experience I had with MDMA the first time I tried it. And I tried it with my girlfriend. We were just so able to, it was such a subtle shift. It was so profound. And yet it was so close to normal processing that it just felt like this enormous gift. And then it was legal at the time, and I saw so much good come from it. And in '84, I started a nonprofit before MAPS to try to protect the therapeutic use of it. And we were distributing it to a large number of people because it was legal, people that could testify in court, including monks and rabbis and psychiatrists. And we actually ended up, the DEA did move against it as ecstasy. They didn't know about its therapeutic use. And in the court case, we had one rabbi compare MDMA to the Sabbath. A monk compared it to, you could spend your whole lifetime trying to learn to meditate, to have an experience of that kind of peace. And psychiatrists were talking about it. And the DEA freaked out and they criminalized MDMA. They moved to do that in '84. And so the hearing was going well. And in '85, DEA freaked out. We were winning in the court of opinion, winning in the court, and they criminalized MDMA. And then we won the court. Later, the judge said it should be in medicine, but the head of the DEA rejected that. So it just seemed like this precious gift that could only come back into legal use through the FDA. There was so much resistance in every other way that it could only be through the FDA, and that it would have to be done as a nonprofit because the pharmaceutical industries weren't interested, because MDMA was off patent. The government was in the middle of escalating the drug war, and so there was no government money for that, and massive propaganda. And because of that, none of the foundations were going to support it. The major foundations, that was too controversial for them. And so I just felt like it needed to come from individual philanthropy. And so MAPS was created as a nonprofit psychedelic and marijuana pharmaceutical company. And that was 34 years ago.
And that's amazing. And now, of course, it's evolved. I mean, I feel like we're closer than ever before to FDA approval, but where are we actually at? Because I think that people might, I mean, there are people that use it with their psychotherapists. There are people that use it socially in ceremony, but it's still not really, well, there's MDMA and then there's also psilocybin.
Yeah.
So I want to also...
And ayahuasca,
So what are you focusing on in all of that? And that will obviously lead to an even bigger opening.
Yeah, well, what we're focusing on is trying to convince the regulatory establishment and also the leading scientists and neuroscientists and therapists in this whole area. For strategic reasons, I felt like of all the psychedelics, MDMA was the most gentle. It's the easiest to integrate. we believe therapists or psychiatrists should have an experience with it if they want to help them be better therapists. People are more likely to do that than psychedelics. So it was MDMA for, and then we needed a patient population that didn't get a lot of help from the traditional medicines, that some people got better, but there's a large population of people that still didn't get better, and also that they were sympathetic to the American population, and that became PTSD from women sexually abused, violence of all kinds, and veterans. So MDMA for PTSD was the strategy, and then the evolution of it so far, where's this incredible spot right now with FDA. And so we have negotiated with FDA about, we have to do 2 phase 3 studies, 2 large-scale phase 3 studies to prove safety and efficacy. We have to do a whole host of other sort of supplementary studies about what happens if people take it on a full stomach, or hepatic impairment, what people's liver function as well, or certain kind of toxicity studies in pregnant rats and various different things we have to do. And we have to develop commercial quantities and commercial scale for all of this. So we have to do a lot of different things, but the main 2 things we have to do are these 2 phase 3 studies, each 100 persons. And so we're permitted to do what's called an interim analysis, an early look at the data. We don't see it, but an independent data monitoring committee looks at the unblinded data, compares the actuals to the hypotheticals of how we design the study, and gives us information if we need to add anybody to the study to make it statistically significant. It would mean that it didn't work quite as well as we thought for whatever reason, but it still worked, and you can get statistical significance by adding some more people, which makes it cost more and all. So we had this interim analysis in March from when we had 60% or 60 people of the first 100, and we had all 100 enrolled. And the FDA, permitted us to just get this number, and then we report to them. And so what the number was 0, meaning we didn't need to add anybody. We had a 90% or greater probability of success. But because of COVID, the FDA has contacted us, and they said that, and not just us, this is happening to all different pharmaceutical sponsors that have research in progress. And they're saying, are you close enough along? Would you like to end the study early? There's a risk in that because you have fewer subjects, so it's a little bit harder to get as good a statistical significance from it. But we've negotiated that, and we've they've accepted to end at 90 instead of 100. And the 90, we're going to have, the last person is going to be, the last data point is at the end of July. And so then through August and September, we're going to be able to analyze the data, and we'll know now at that point, before the end of September, if the first of 2 phase 3 studies was statistically significant, which means it's a success. And just to say that there's 2 drugs that the FDA has designated as breakthrough therapies for PTSD. One is MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, that treatment. The other is a recycled sleeping pill from over 30 years ago called Tonmya by Tonix Pharmaceuticals, and it was for PTSD as well, and they got breakthrough designation. And they had their interim analysis in February. We had ours in March. And so they were disappointed to learn that their drug did not work, and that they'd spent well over $100 million to try to do this breakthrough drug in phase 3 for PTSD, and it failed. So the fact that our breakthrough therapy drug in phase 3 had a positive interim analysis is super encouraging. And but we're slowed down on doing the second phase 3 study. So that's the problem. We had anticipated we'd be done by next summer. Now we're thinking we might not even be done until 2022 sometime, or the end of 2021. And then we think by the end of 2022, early 2023, hopefully we will, if the data keeps coming as we hope, we'll have approval for prescription use. There's another program called Expanded Access, which is compassionate use. The Israeli Ministry of Health has approved 50 people in Israel for compassionate use, and they're paying half the cost of it, roughly $500,000 in services and facility fees and therapists. And then we've had to raise, and Natalie's done a lot of this on, the other $500,000. But so Israel's first to kind of support this expanded access compassionate use while we're doing phase 3 in Israel as well. And here in the US, compassionate use means that it goes in parallel to phase 3, but there's no control group. the FDA doesn't look at the data in that way, and so people have to pay for it themselves. But it's offered on a compassionate basis. We have approval for 50 people in this compassionate protocol, and then we're anticipating the data looking pretty good, and then we'll get approval for hundreds and hundreds of more, and that should go until the time that we get the approval for prescription use, because we've picked sites where it's not our phase 3 sites, so it's not going to slow down phase 3, and there is a lot of people that want help with their PTSD. There's roughly 8 million people with PTSD in the US.
Wow.
Yeah.
So this is huge. And even Kate Levinson is here that says something. And I want to give a shout out, by the way, I didn't get to say Natalie Ginsburg, who helped coordinate this. It was so great in coordinating this. She's the Director of Policy and Advocacy at MAPS. Shout out to Natalie, who might jump in to answer things or join the conversation at any point. So Kate Levinson, I don't know if you want to turn your audio on, just ask this question. You're welcome to. Yeah.
I had thought that he was going to say ketamine when he had mentioned the drug from the 70s, the sleeping drug. So I was curious, what is going on with ketamine? That's obviously is like happening.
Yeah. So ketamine is a really good example of a bunch of different things. So first off, it's a good example of how people that were very involved in psychedelics, like myself and a bunch of others who experimented with ketamine, completely missed the idea that it was good for depression because we weren't depressed. So we didn't notice this shift. So that was amazing to me. It was really discovered by anesthesiologists who used ketamine. And they noticed that some of their patients who were depressed before weren't so depressed after operations. And then it started being looked at by the National Institute of Mental Health, which is a really good credit to the National Institute of Mental Health. Now, ketamine, it's another example though. Ketamine itself was the main battlefield anesthetic in Vietnam, and it's generic and super cheap. So this is an example of for-profit pharma maximizing profit. So what they did is, instead of trying to make ketamine, looking at ketamine for depression, which is probably as good or better than the mix. So the isomers, there's molecules are sort of mirror images, right and left hand crystals, roughly 50-50 percentages, and they do act differently. They're the same structure, but they go to different places in the brain, so they're slightly different in what they do. And so Johnson & Johnson patented one of these isomers, S-ketamine, for depression. Nobody thought of doing the isomer, and they're selling it for hundreds and hundreds of dollars, and they're delivering it as a treatment without therapy. This is just a kind of pharmacological treatment, and it does work for a bunch of people. Taking it in that way with virtually no preparation, virtually no follow-up integration, but just here's an experience. Some of the anesthesiologists actually still use, they give ketamine in the beds that they used to give people electroconvulsive therapy in, and sometimes still do. So there is now starting to be studies that are looking at combining ketamine with psychotherapy. And there's, you're going to probably get better outcomes, and you will just need less ketamine. So it's not quite as good for the manufacturer. And there will be studies funded by philanthropists, not being funded by the companies. So the company is now trying to optimize therapeutic outcomes. And what's happening is insurance companies are starting to cover the generic for a few bucks and the therapy, even though what was only approved by the FDA was this isomer. So that's for depression. Now, for PTSD, people have used ketamine for PTSD too. In the 1990s, the only psychedelic research taking place anywhere in the world in patients was in Russia, in St. Petersburg, by a Dr. Yevgeny Krupitsky. This is how shut down psychedelic research was. The only place in the entire world was in Russia, ketamine, and it was ketamine-assisted psychotherapy for alcoholism and heroin addiction. And he was getting really good results. We worked with him. We funded his research in some parts. We worked with him on his methodology. He's an MD, PhD, was working with the National Institute on Drug Abuse. So there was this history of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. But then Russia shut it down completely because they're heavy-handed and oppressive, and ketamine started being used recreationally. So they wiped that out, and they wiped out the research as well. So ketamine has been used for PTSD as well. And just to say that I think that one fundamental thing that we've found is that the therapeutic outcomes are not related to the mystical experience with MDMA assisted psychotherapy. But with psilocybin, with LSD, with all of those classic psychedelics, there's a link between the mystical experience and therapeutic outcomes. And
that's really interesting.
yeah, and so I think that there's something about the ego dissolution that helps you create new patterns. You have to process things, but the classic psychedelics lead more to that kind of ego dissolution experience. With MDMA, people score actually pretty high on the same scale, the mystical experience questionnaire, but we've done these correlation analyses and there's no correlation. So I think you need to be more or less, as a human being, as an intact ego, thinking about those things that traumatized you. And that's where those painful memories are attached. And you need to go back to those kind of memories or those feelings, even if you don't attach it to a story, that you work through these feelings, but they're feelings that you had as an individual. Now there is multi-generational trauma, and there is, we're working, for 30 years, we've been trying to start research inside the Bronx, inside the VA, and now we're working with Rachel Yehuda, who is the principal investigator in charge of mental health at the Bronx VA, and she's an expert in epigenetics, and she did work with Holocaust survivors and their children, and she showed how either the male or the female who's been traumatized can transfer sort of genetic material that is not part of the gene itself, but what turns on the genes, and that can go from generation to generation through the sperm and the egg, and that there is this kind of set point, you could say, for anxiety or depression, or it's not clear what memories, if any, get transferred. But in any case, the idea is that ketamine has lots of potential, but I think it'll be much more effective when combined with therapy.
Okay, we have some other questions, and I was going to ask, and I'm about to go to your questions in the chat. How has COVID impacted openness around psychedelics, or has it?
Well, there's one thing about COVID that has just been amazing. Never in the history of the world have we've been so linked, and so seeing our fates are linked with everybody. Viruses travel all over the globe. It's just been amazing. So, and also the burnout that's happening in the medical profession and the people that are under stress and social anxiety. So it's increased the appreciation for emotional struggles, you could say, and our interconnectedness. And so I see more people see the importance of this kind of research, of helping individuals and societies and humans process all this stress and trauma and death, and that I think it's brought that more to the fore.
And I'm sure also, as we're seeing with everything around racial injustices and police brutality, the real need to heal, and the generational trauma there as well as current trauma.
Yeah, the way I would describe it is, for those of you that may know Abraham Maslow and the sort of hierarchy of needs, he talked about humanistic psychology. He talked about self-actualization as the kind of human performance. The peak performance was this self-actualization. This is now sort of positive psychology we're at now, but it was to get out of all this neuroses, but it was about what is our peak performance? How do we actualize ourselves? And in the last few years of his life, he changed that when he started learning more about psychedelic research and other things. And this isn't taught as much in schools, but he changed this hierarchy of needs so that the top was not self-actualization anymore, but it was self-transcendence. So it was this sense of being part of this whole, of trying to bring this fullness of expression to the whole group, you could say, of realizing that you're a small part of this bigger thing. So it's not just improving yourself. And so I think that's where we're at with, humanity as a whole, and a lot of us as individuals, moving from this kind of survival to this sort of collective thinking. And then we got to confront climate change and nuclear weapons and all that. So I'm super hopeful, and I think psychedelics can play a big role.
I love that, self-actualization to self-transcendence, something for us all to think about what that means to us. All right, let's go to the question from Erica Folinsky. If you want to turn your audio on. Or not, I'll read it.
I was like, did I end up actually sending my question? Oh, well, okay. So I was actually in a conference actually the other day with Dr. Bill Richards and, well, oh, wait, because their names are like the mix of each other. Dr. Bill Richards and Brian Richards.
Yeah, father.
So yeah, that was really awesome. But I'm like kind of processing what they were saying with psilocybin and with the ego dissolution and PTSD, and also with the hopefulness of what you're saying about MDMA. And also I'm a therapist who primarily focuses on trauma and like somatic methods. But also like part of what they're saying with like the ego dissolution and trauma, it's like, and also what you're saying about trauma, it's part of like what goes there is the letting go of fear and control, because that's what trauma is based in. And then it's like,
do you have a question? I realized it was just more of you had something to say, but I wasn't sure you had a question.
I mean, I'm amazed that like that we're getting this far, because like it is super important and I'm super hopeful. But I'm also a little bit like, I'm a little bit confused about with like the ego dissolution and saying where with trauma, it's not as good to have like the ego dissolution part, and with MDMA, like how that's better, because with how I look at trauma, like letting go of that fear and control, that is better to have like that ego dissolution opportunity.
Well, all right, I'll say that the very first psychedelic that was ever used for PTSD, and the whole idea of psychedelics for PTSD, was a Dutch psychiatrist, Dr. Bastiaans, after World War II, and this is starting to be in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. He worked with LSD for what he called concentration camp syndrome. And so there's actually an incredible book, Shaviti, A Vision, about an Israeli Holocaust survivor and writer who went for therapy with LSD for the concentration camp syndrome. And he wrote a book about what the therapy was like. So it's Shivitti, Shaviti, A Vision. It's an incredible book. My Israeli relatives knew the guy, and also from reading the book, that the classic psychedelics there don't have the fear reduction that MDMA does. They have that potential to sort of let go into sort of this deeper spiritual experience, but it's very difficult for people that are traumatized. It's scary that they've got so much that they've had to keep inside, so that those drugs can be really maybe in a secondary thing. So I think in the future, we might have several sessions with MDMA to help people deal with sort of this repressed pain and get us confidence of that, and then move to something like psilocybin or LSD. So I think that the mystical experience doesn't seem correlated with reductions in PTSD symptoms. So there's a whole other measure that we use called post-traumatic growth. So that's a concept too that's been developing, is this idea of post-traumatic growth, that you, around half of the people that are traumatized develop some refinement of what their purpose in life is. They rethink what their mission is, how they are with their loved ones, and how they are in their life. And so there's this post-traumatic growth. And I think the mystical experience can be very helpful in this post-traumatic growth process. But getting past the trauma, the mystical experience doesn't seem to be a critical factor.
Amazing. All right, we have many questions coming in, so let's just try to get to everyone. John Shuford.
Everyone. So
Hi.
I'm curious, I'm a cognitive psychology graduate student, and what I'm working on is physiological mechanisms of depression, essentially. And I'm curious if you have any perspectives on where psychedelic research is headed in terms of physiological understanding of various clinical pathologies and such. Rock is an alternative to DSM.
Yes, that's the way that the National Institute of Mental Health is organized now too. Yeah, they're trying to think of trying to look at biological correlates or things. They're not so thrilled by the DSM, for sure. So there are, well, I would say that mechanism of action, figuring that stuff out is harder than figuring out if it works or not. Figuring out how it works is really super complex. And I don't know that there's always that translational neuroscience into figuring out how it works to helping you make it work better. But there's something that's going to be happening at Yale really soon, which is for the first time, a PTSD patient is going to go into a scanner under the influence of MDMA. So we've had PTSD patients that went into scanners before and after their therapy with us, but they're not under the drug when they're having a scan. This is, there have been healthy volunteers that have taken MDMA in a scanner, and you can see how their brain is processing and where the activity is more increased or decreased or how things are related. But there's never been a PTSD patient. So this is going to be the first time we'll have a PTSD patient in the scanner. And I think that's where a lot of psychedelic research is moving in that direction. We're going to be having more courageous volunteers, you could say, to do some of these brain scan stuff that's requires you to be confined, and if you're traumatized by something that had to do with confining you, can't move for an hour inside of these scanners. It's kind of difficult. Plus, the other thing that's so interesting, though, is that this is going to be an attempt from an experimental point of view, if you think about it, that this is, what does the drug do without a lot of therapy? How do we see what does the drug do almost independent of therapy? So there are ethical concerns like that when you take a PTSD patient and you give, or a depressed patient, or you do anything like that, give them these scanning things. So particularly when they're under the influence of the drug. So we've trained the people that are doing this. They're not just neuroscientists, they're also therapists. And they will have discussions, but only just very minimal, like one prep session. They're only going to be in the scanner for an hour, but they'll be under the influence of MDMA for about 6 hours. So they'll have time where they're sitting around with these people talking about their issues, and they go into the scanner, and then there's like one integrated thing. So it's going to be combining in a little bit of a way, what does MDMA do with the minimal surround to make it safe? And what does it physiologically do? And what you're in the brain scan, people are asking you traumatic memories or fond memories or neutral memories. You just see how your brain reacts. And they'll do this again when they're not on MDMA, or they've probably done it before without on MDMA. And then they do it later, and they go through the same exercises. So we're also getting to be an incredible study. We're starting to learn about psychedelics and neurogenesis. And psychedelics, MDMA promotes, there's a paper in Nature from last year, MDMA promotes the release of oxytocin, which is the hormone of love and nursing mothers. And then you end up seeing that this oxytocin release causes new neural connections in prosocial areas of the brain in mice, dissected. And so we see that with psilocybin. There's a certain amount of neurogenesis. Well, neurogenesis means the birth of new neurons. This is more neural sprouting and stuff, but there may even be connections we're not yet sure. So I think there's so much to learn in that area that you're coming in at a really good time, though, too, because you'll be able to do experiments of all different kinds that weren't so possible before, with the new equipment, and also bringing people into the equipment while they're under the influence of the different drugs.
So we have a question from Sam Moncarch. If you want to.
Yeah.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rick, for taking the time.
Sure.
You can. I have a question regarding patients suffering from PTSD, but having been prescribed antidepressants, SSRIs, for decades.
Yeah.
My mother being one specifically, and I've really tried to engage her far more in, being open and brave to different types of therapy. But I know in Julie Holland's interview on NPR, talked about the difficulties of what prolonged SSRI treatment does to the efficacy of MDMA. What is basically assuming, you know, patients that are qualified for MAP studies, I assume have some sort of treatment that they're dealing with before arriving at an MDMA assisted therapy session.
Yeah.
What's that fine line like?
Yeah. So the first thing to say is that we do find that the longer people, we require everybody to taper off their SSRIs or their psychiatric medicines before they go into MDMA therapy. And it seems that the longer people have tapered off of those medicines, the better they do. There's exceptions to that and stuff, but just more or less. So we require people to taper off under the supervision of their prescribing physician before they're actually starting the process of being in the study. We're still with them, but it's 5 half-lives plus a week or two is the minimum. So that would be the situation with your mother. It doesn't matter how long she's taking it, but it's 5 half-lives and ideally 2 weeks. And that can be difficult. So there is, the FDA says that the baseline for what we look at in the experiment in phase 3 is not the baseline when people come to us. That would make sense in a certain way. They're on their medicines. They still have PTSD. They have to have severe PTSD, even though they're, you know, if they're being medicated, they still have to have severe PTSD. But the baseline that the FDA wants us to do is we have to re-baseline them after they've tapered off their medicines. And what we find is some people actually do better when they're off their medicines. Just it made them foggy. There was different side effects. You know, so, but some people also now have more difficult emotions that are coming to the surface, and it takes a while to go through the tapering process. There is some concern, and so that's what we do. There's some suggestions that that you can overwhelm that muting effect of the SSRIs with more MDMA. But there is this concern about the serotonin syndrome and people overheating, and we know that MDMA is contributing to that. So we really think that it's better for people to taper off their medicines. And then the message is too, that whatever feelings are coming up, even if they're difficult, this is now starting this healing process. You don't need to suppress it, so that we try to use the tapering process to really help people get ready for processing difficult emotions.
Gina from Kindra Connect, and I saw you, Orly, so I'll go to you as well, had a question that I think definitely relates to why we even, you know, besides my own fascination with psychedelics and being a proponent, and Natalie being my cousin also, shout out, because I didn't say she was a member of my family, but you know, the connection between mindfulness and psychedelics, and I think Gina had something to ask around that.
Yeah, I've got a bunch to say.
Yeah, Gina.
Curious in terms of thinking about mindful practices like meditation and yoga, and how different psychedelics, whether it's MDMA or mushrooms, fit into that. I mean, I feel like, or ayahuasca, which seems almost way more intense than comparing to a yoga or meditation. But yeah, I was just interested in how you frame that, how you think about mindfulness and psychedelics.
Yeah, well, I think the therapists, so in an 8-hour session, usually it's a male-female team, but not always. For one patient, it's an 8-hour session. Their eyes are closed, listening to music. Roughly half the time with MDMA, they're having this own internal imagery and flow of feelings and emotions. The other half of the time, they're talking to the therapists, or no particular order. So the therapists itself are often in this mindfulness kind of state, in this meditative state, because what you're doing is you're not speaking to the patient, you're observing them, you're seeing what's going on. You don't have that much to do otherwise. You've got a co-therapist. You might be sort of whispering or something, ideas about what's going on, but the therapists themselves are very meditative and mindful. For the tools that are taught to patients in terms of mindfulness, they're good about not reacting with fear, is about helping you process emotions. It's kind of a natural. So there's a fellow, Jim Gordon, who has started the Center for Mind-Body Medicine in Washington, D.C. He's one of the main proponents. He's in his 80s now. He also has done a lot of work in Israel and Gaza with teaching mindfulness to children to process trauma. And what he said was that he's been waiting for mindfulness to get accepted enough that he can bring in MDMA as well. And that MDMA in combination with a mindfulness program is likely to be highly effective, and even more effective than the mindfulness program by itself. Or MDMA if you just give it to somebody in a scanner, for example. You know, so I think that a lot of the mindfulness is in the same direction. The MDMA, the way that we instruct people is, first off, we're not the guide. You know, they're the guide. It's coming from their own unconscious, and that it's like this meditative sense in that, you know, you want to bring things to the surface. Stan Grof has got this beautiful statement that Stan Grof is the leading LSD researcher and therapist in the world and helped develop transpersonal psychology. He worked with Maslow on this transition to self-transcendence from self-actualization. But Stan talked about how you become the full expression of an emotion is the funeral pyre of that emotion. And that thought is so neat. So if you think you're stuck in hell and it's never going to end, or you're in this painful place that this, you know, and that you can't bear it, you know, the approach in LSD therapy, the approach even in mindfulness is this unattachment in a way, to let it happen and to just let it be. And so that idea that the full expression of it will make a change. Everything changes that once you've done with the resist. So all of this is to say that there was a 2-week program at the San Diego Naval Medical Center for Navy SEALs and Marines with PTSD, and it was a mindfulness-based program. And the person that was in charge of it wanted to add an MDMA day, but we could never quite get permission for that. Inside the Department of Defense, we were approved to kind of do work with people affiliated with Veterans Administration. But one day, I think that we really want to have a blended MDMA mindfulness program.
Wow, that's awesome. We also have, all right, let's move to Andrew D'Angelo. Andrew, are you there? If you're there, I'll just, you turn your audio on if you want. He asked about these compounds being traded in public markets in an industry that may not be ready to be an industry yet. But does the fragmentation that is happening with massive growth of awareness of these compounds, does that concern you?
The fragmentation? I don't
I mean, I was just reading this. So I think it is just saying as a state becomes, there you go. There you are.
Sorry. Hi, Rick.
Hi.
So, you know, one of the things, I come from the cannabis community, and I've been a leader in legalizing cannabis and sort of giving birth to the industry. And I worry you're starting to see companies being publicly traded in Canada dealing with psilocybin. You're starting to see a huge amount of awareness, much of it healthy, about psychedelics through Michael Pollan's book and others. And I'm wondering how you feel about, you know, lots of other groups perhaps starting that may have similar missions, their MAPS, people that are more interested in making money off these compounds than using them to heal people in society. And if you're concerned about that, what you're seeing, what kind of conversations in the community and the leaders of the community that you're having about this, and, you know, what kind of lessons could we learn from some of the things that have happened with respect to cannabis so that they don't happen with respect to psychedelics?
Okay, great, super great question. But can you just elaborate a tiny bit more? What would you say has happened with cannabis, and what lesson do you see?
Well, I mean, for a long time, cannabis was, if you go back to the 1970s, we weren't able to end prohibition using the arguments of personal freedom. Right. Then AIDS happened, and once we started talking about cannabis as wellness and using the frame of therapeutics, then people started to support ending prohibition and reform and sort of ending the madness, right? And then we were able to be in that paradigm, that wellness paradigm, for 20 some years until adult use legalization came along. And then the paradigm didn't necessarily change from wellness, but it started to include other things. And one of the other things it included was profits and publicly traded companies, frameworks for legalization and taxation and distribution and access that don't work very well, that aren't understood by elected officials. It's been a real sort of disaster bringing medical cannabis, or adult use cannabis for that matter, in a safe, accessible, affordable way to everybody who either voted to make it happen or is anxiously awaiting the opportunity for legalization to occur where they may live. And the conversation with respect to cannabis is now not, so a lot of us have to remind the world that cannabis is a wellness product now. That's unfortunate, because bad things can happen, bad behavior can happen, and then the plant and some of the adversaries that may still exist can perhaps have ways of putting the genie back in the bottle.
Yeah. Okay. So I see.
Thank you for the question, by the way.
Yeah. So on the one hand, the scale of the need is so great that I'm not against for-profit companies doing ethical business. And whether they do ethical business or not, I think that we need nonprofit competitors for these for-profit companies, but we should welcome them. So I think we compete by creating a better example, or, I think in healthcare in general, the profit motive in America has really caused an enormous squandering of resources and inequitable access, and we have terrible health outcomes, but we spend so much money. So the whole profit motive in health is questionable, what it's done. I believe in patents and innovation and driving people to experiment. And so what we've seen a little bit is what may be some overbroad kind of patent claims, or definitely overbroad patent claims by some of the for-profit companies. And it's okay to patent what you've learned, what you've invented, but not go overbroad to try to block other people. But I think that the pressure is going to be, overall, I think it's a good thing. I think that it helps with the mainstreaming. We need to really keep a very eye out on, does it turn into this just profit maximization? And so that's where USONA is the group in Madison was working on psilocybin in a nonprofit way. MAPS is doing that. There's a lot of other for-profit people that we are engaging in dialogues with and discussions with. I think we will try to create a standard of practice that will be helpful. But what I'm worried about is the pressure on trying to make the treatment as inexpensive as possible and minimizing the training of therapies. So if we could say the things that would make it grow too fast are untrained therapists administering this in all different ways. That's what I'm concerned about. And so we're negotiating with FDA, with DEA, so that these are not approved like normal drugs. They're approved only for the use of people that have been trained in the therapy, so that and it's only under direct supervision. So as the medical use, I think we'll be able to keep that in a high quality way. At the same way, what you said was so important about medicalization, changes people's attitudes. That's why we're going to lead towards legalization. So I think what we're anticipating is 2022, 2023 MDMA clinics. Shortly after that should be psilocybin clinics. Now we're already seeing bunches of ketamine clinics. We are seeing lots and lots of ayahuasca without intimidation from the DEA. Sort of the ayahuasca circles are relatively very safe, surprisingly. And at the same time, I think it'll take about a decade. So we're assuming 2035 becomes this time for overall prohibition to end, and for there to be license legalization for these drugs. And that would mean you'd get a license to do it. You'd go to one of these psychedelic clinics, you have an experience, you know what you're getting in for. And then if you misbehave, you lose your license to buy, as well as get punished for whatever you did. So I think that from the other part of what we've seen with marijuana, most of the jobs have gone to white people, the power, the establishment and all. And so I just heard, Natalie, this will shock you. I just heard from someone that I've been working with on issues that there is now support for cannabis production by a political person in Alabama. And it happens to be Jeff Sessions is now supporting it because it's jobs in his area. And this is like,
wow,
so
that is shocking.
It is kind of shocking. So I think that we're trying to do sort of equitable to the extent. And so I think, Natalie, maybe this is a good time for you to say a little bit about training of the therapists of color, because we want to sort of have this, the services are really, this is not like marijuana where everybody can grow it in your own yard or things like this. There's only going to be a certain number of manufacturers of these synthetic chemicals and big chemical supply.
And I actually, someone said here that, which I kind of think goes into, and Natalie, we can bring you in. It's like the regulation on therapy would erase ancient shamans, medicine people have traditionally and culturally been working with this medicine. So I think it is the idea of like whitewashing also again.
Okay, but let me say that's a good point. That's a super good point. Let me respond to that before we get to Natalie, which is that what we're trying to do simultaneously is what Natalie is trying to do, drug policy reform, so that people can get it if they want to, in a shamanistic way, or that they could get it in any of these other different ways, and that these drugs are eventually made legal in all of those different ways, without medicine, without religion, personal growth. So in a medicalized setting, yeah, so there's a woman named Victoria Hale, who's on our board of directors, who started a nonprofit pharma that raised 160 million from Gates, and to do drugs for India, for parasites and stuff. Then she got 60 million from the Buffetts for nonprofit low-cost contraceptives for the US and the third world, and she did that. Now she wants to make ayahuasca into medicine. Her view is that it should only be shamans. She's going to try to talk the FDA into shamans from, quote, South America, being the ones that run the ceremonies, but in the FDA context. So we are not trying to whitewash, we are not, and let me just say that the other part is that these societies are heavily influenced by the Catholic Church, the South American societies, these ayahuasca religions, even the peyote religion, they've been dominated by Western societies. They've adopted some of the bad practices. They're patriarchal, homophobic. So these are not like beautiful states of nature that we have to accept. And I'll just say that as a Reformed Jew, I think it's our obligation to take the past and reinterpret it for the present. And that we're not trying to block any, we're trying to make it easier for everybody to get the kind of context they want, but we are negotiating in these highly regulated situations, and it will be licensed therapist for MDMA.
Did you want to add anything, Natalie, to that?
Sure. I'll say that first of all, I am grateful working with MAPS. Our focus is on MDMA, where there is not this long, deep history of cultural use, and so that does also feel a bit different in our approach, though I do want to also acknowledge that MDMA can be derived from a plant called sassafras that Native Americans have had practices with. But I know before Rick was asking to speak a bit about the training that we did, the MDMA training for communities of color. And I do see a few questions in the chat about cultural trauma and like systemic trauma and racial trauma. So I can speak a bit about that, which as, because of structural racism and many other factors, a lot of the researchers and therapists working in the psychedelic community have been predominantly white over the last few decades. Also because it's, it can be quite dangerous, or, you have to be able to speak publicly about drugs and things like that. There's more safety usually afforded to white people to be able to do that. So MAPS recognize this, and we were able to hold a training focused exclusively on therapists of color in an effort to kind of balance or better start the process of expanding our therapist pool. And this was important for so many reasons, but one of the many things that inspired this was also hearing from a lot of clients of normal therapy clients, not even necessarily in the context of MDMA therapy, but that how having a therapist that is culturally informed and really understands your context makes such a huge difference. And often people can actually be re-traumatized by therapists who don't understand systemic racism or can kind of perpetuate microaggressions and things of that sort. So we know with MDMA that really heightens sensitivities that we need to be really extra careful with with people that are holding this work as an MDMA therapist. And I guess I'll just end by saying it was really awesome. We trained 55 therapists of color last August in Louisville, Kentucky, which was just a really inspiring. And therapists are actually all still meeting weekly and in touch. So we're hoping that's just the beginning of that work. And I guess, I'm sorry, one more thing I'll say, because I appreciate the questions about cultural trauma and racial trauma, or this idea of experiencing trauma from injustice, from the daily experience of social injustice, from generations and generations of injustice exerted on your family. And so recognizing that can be a bit different than treating something like PTSD that someone might have experienced from war, where there's a bit more isolated of an experience. And even though many folks that develop PTSD in war also experience early childhood trauma and stuff, there's still, can be a bit more discrete and in the past, but things like racial trauma and cultural trauma are ongoing. So they definitely require more nuance and thoughtfulness with the treatment and how we're approaching that.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for that. I'm going to spotlight Rick again because we don't have a lot of time, but I want to get, Orly had a question. I'm going to try to get let's be as quick as possible because we're probably going to end by in the next 10 or so, in like 15 minutes max. We could have gone for 2 hours, which we should have done, but maybe we'll do a part 2 at a certain point. So Orly, I want to turn your audio, unmute. No, did she? Maybe if she's not there. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, hi. First of all, I just want to say that I'm more than elated to hear that that everything is done, how would I say, not under the influence of any kind of psychotropic medications. I've been training with David Burns for many, many years, and although he's a psychiatrist and he taught Stanford Medical School for many years, he has not prescribed one antidepressant in 50 years. So he's far away from spirituality and from anything else. He's a behaviorist. But he claims, and that's my experience as a therapist, that when you take medication, you just don't learn anything. So it's really, really important news, in my opinion. The other part is, so by the way, I belong to a synagogue that was, that had Zalman Schachter Shalomi for many years.
Great.
So for years and years, I was always curious about, about psychedelics. And then 25 years ago, 30 years ago, I found some Israeli newspaper with an interview with Katzatnik, who's actually the author of that. So I was looking for stuff, and all of a sudden I realized, oh, there was the Los Angeles psychedelic conference that I missed. And that's what I want to say. For some reason, education is not widely available. It's really, now I found horizons. So I've been religiously going to the conferences, but I really think that a lot of attention should be put into education. Brian Richards, I attended the psilocybin seminar just yesterday or Friday.
Yeah,
and he talked about the need for thousands of therapists. You need to train. On the other hand, it's pretty obvious that people like me who are established psychologists with practice and everything are not going to be able to do the hand-on work, because he said it will be too expensive. He's looking for people that are not licensed and not, you know. So, and the other part is that I told, I asked the, just 1 second.
Yeah.
I also asked the same question to Brian and Bill, is even MAPS, you guys charge $10,000 for training. Right. This is not affordable. So I don't want to bring down the, the celebratory.
Yeah. No. So
yeah, he'll answer. Thanks. Yeah. Thank you, Arlie.
So that's a really good point. So what we've decided, since we operate public benefit perspective, is that the benefit comes from treating people. So we're not trying to make money off the training. So the training is what it costs us. And most of that, or about half of that cost, is for a protocol that we have approval with the FDA to give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. So that, it also includes, there's a week-long in-person residential program, and there's supervision when you're working with a PTSD patient. So the training, I think, it's expensive, but it can be over time, but we're trying to do it at our cost. And so the other part about it, you were saying that, it can't be at experienced psychologist rates because it won't be reimbursed. And that is our challenge, to try to persuade insurance companies. But what we're showing is that people get short-term intensive treatment that is more expensive than if you just give them a pill, or if you just even have them see a therapist for once an hour a week or something. This is roughly 40 hours of therapy for severe PTSD. And it's with 2 people, not just one. And what we want is the second one, ideally, to be a student, not working at the same rate as the lead person. But it's our job to show that this deep intervention gets such deep healing that lasts and persists and reduces people's other health care and gets them back into life and working, and so that it's cost effective. So it is going to be our challenge to try to persuade insurance companies to do this. But the groups, one way to be looking at this is also going to be group therapy. We haven't looked at that yet, but that may be a way to really reduce the cost of the therapy. But it is expensive, but I think that it will be cost effective, and that it's not going to be nearly as expensive as when you add up even just a few years of the alternative of people not getting it. So I think that it may be different again a little bit with psilocybin, but we are looking for experienced trauma therapists to be part of this training. And that then there will be all sorts of people willing to come to them. I mean, they already have probably enough work, but this is to learn something new that will not just help them, I think, just with the MDMA patients, but it can, well, actually, I'll say this, it's been sad. A lot of the therapists that work with us on the study say that it's very hard for them to go back to their patients and not be able to give them MDMA, to see that they're stuck and that there's only so much you can do, and that this drug helps them get unstuck. And that's why we're working on it so much. So, but I would just say that I think we will be able to make the case that it's reimbursable.
All right, Carrie, just quickly ask your question without a lot of, just if you want to go right to it, if you're there.
Yeah. My grandmother was part of a experimental, sorry, I don't know if you can
I think
see me.
the effects of MDMA on the growing or adolescent brain was a good question too.
Okay, but also she was part of the Allen Memorial at McGill.
Right. Oh my God. That's
yes,
horrible.
and she was part of it. She was a survivor from a pogrom in Russia, and she was treated at the Allen Memorial. And there was a long-term lawsuit because, of course, and they used electroshock therapy, but LSD was part of it. So I was just wondering, because she was one of the trauma victims that was part of it, and it didn't heal her. I think it really numbed her. So what do you have to say about that? And of course, I'm an educator, so I also asked about the effects on the adolescent brain.
Okay, good. Let me speak to both of those. But let me first say that The Allen Memorial Institute was funded by the CIA.
It was, yeah.
Research.
You're right.
And I actually spoke there a couple years ago at the Allen Memorial Institute to try, because I felt like as part of bringing back psychedelics, as the psychedelic renaissance, there's certain things that you need to do that are symbolic. We see that in a way as toppling some of these Confederate statues, you know, to get over that history of racism. But one of the things was starting research with LSD. That's the most scary psychedelic. The other was starting research at Harvard, because that's where Timothy Leary was, and that's where we think it went off the rails. The third and final step is starting research at the Allen Memorial Institute, because that is the worst excesses of the CIA mind control military work with psychedelics. And what they were trying to do was not to heal people at all. This was at a time in the 50s and 60s, and this was the Korean War, and there was fears about people being brainwashed, and all these different tortures of putting you in a hole for a long time and isolation. And so what they were trying to do at the Allen Memorial Institute was to break people's personality down into a pre-verbal state, and then they would build you back up again. It was horrible. They destroyed lots of people's lives. And we have an MDMA PTSD study in Montreal by a psychiatrist trained at McGill, and he arranged for this talk at Allen Memorial Hospital. In Canada, you have to do research with institutional affiliation. You can't just have private practice. And nobody at McGill was willing to sign off on this psychedelic research because of something that happened 50 years ago that's such a stain on their whole background. So the Allen Memorial was a terrible thing, and I'm so sorry that a relative of yours had to be part of it. Yeah. Now, as far as the adolescent brain, let me say that what the FDA has told us is that, and this is in general true, a lot of drugs are studied in adults, and then they're approved, and then they're prescribed off-label to children, and we don't know enough about children. So what the FDA is starting to do is to require or encourage sponsors of research. In this case, they required us what's called phase 4. After the drug, if we get it approved as a medicine for adults, we have to work on MDMA with 12 to 17-year-olds who are traumatized. So the thing to say is these are not healthy adolescents. These are adolescents whose brains have been changed by trauma in a negative way, and that they are suffering major symptoms from PTSD. So they're already not in a good place. We believe, based on what we've seen in adults, that this is likely to work in adolescents as well. That's not true, but maybe it is true. And I think that it is true, and we will be forced to find out, which we are willingly accepting. So I think that the myth of the adolescent brain as being changing, and therefore we should protect it from all drugs, is the last bastion of the justification for the drug war. Save our children. It's totally bogus. If you are overdoing drugs as an adolescent, it's a bad thing. If you drink too much, if you smoke too much pot, if you do psychedelics too much, nothing like that is good all the time. But I think that if you look at the cultures that have integrated psychedelics, like the ayahuasca churches, like the Native American church, they don't have age limits. I was at a Native American church peyote ceremony, and a Navajo man brought his 9-year-old son. And his 9-year-old son stayed up the whole night with us, and he took not as much peyote as the rest of us. There was a study that Charlie Grobe, a psychiatrist that we worked with closely, did with adolescents from ayahuasca, from Brazil, from ayahuasca churches, compared the brains and the behaviors of adolescents that grew up taking ayahuasca versus controls that grew up in more Christian, Catholic, or not syncretic churches, but in traditional churches where they didn't do ayahuasca, but they came from similar cultural background. The kids who grew up taking ayahuasca were better off in terms of certain maturation and things. There was no evidence that they were hurt by that. I think that the occasional use of these things for rites of passage, I think that's really the final step, you could say, of the integration of these psychedelics. And who should make this decision? That's the big issue. Should the government say it's illegal for minors? we think this license legalization will be for adults. Maybe we'll say that's 18 or 16, whatever it'll be, 21, but it'll be for adults. What about people under that? It should be in the hands of the parents. They should be able to decide whether to educate their kids with psychedelics or not. So it's family values in the hands of the parents. And that's what the other cultures, and I think this this thing about adolescence, I just wish that I was so shy and I could barely talk to a girl for years in high school. And if I had been given MDMA when I was like 13 or something, I would have had a way better time in high school. So
on that note, that was amazing. All right, I feel like we need to do a part 2 at a certain point because this has just been so fabulous, and thank you for your time.
Let me just say that Natalie needs to talk about the work with the Israelis and the Palestinians with ayahuasca and MDMA. That's so important.
Well, yeah, do you want to quickly, we need to wrap at 5:15. I wanted to take a deep breath together before we wrap things up. But Natalie, do you want to just mention something? And then I want to know how else people could get involved, or if there's anything else that you want people to know as we wrap up.
Yeah.
I guess I'll just say a quick sentence that we are conducting a research project to understand how psychedelics could play a role in peace building and like conflict resolution, specifically focused on Palestinians and Israelis to start. And we interviewed a bunch of folks who've drank ayahuasca together in joint spaces. And if you're interested, there's a few talks that me and my colleagues have done around that and sharing some of those results. And we're working on a study now, actually creating this space instead of just interviewing people about their experience. But maybe I'll let Rick also end, because I know there's one exciting thing that MAPS, or many things, but one thing in particular that MAPS is really working on right now.
You're thinking of the capstone?
I am.
Okay, so we have been approached recently and for the last year or two by investors who want to invest, and this gets back to an earlier question. They're willing to pay all the money that we need, up to 50 million or more, to bring MDMA therapy around the world, to finish our research here, and we don't want to do that. So we really feel that this should be done through philanthropy, that then we will market MDMA in this public benefit way, whereas our for-profit public benefit corporation paying taxes on the sale of MDMA, and it being 100% owned by the nonprofit. So we have raised about $90 million in the history of MAPS in 34 years. And we, 10 million of that is part of this $30 million, what we're calling the capstone campaign. And it's to complete the phase 3 studies, to train therapists, to do commercialization, to do expanded access, to and get approval in Israel and in Canada, because we have 2 sites in Israel, 2 in Canada, and 11 throughout the United States for phase 3. So we've raised 10 million from our board and from key allies, the Psychedelic Science Funding Collaborative. Then Tim Ferriss announced a couple weeks ago, but that actually 2 weeks ago, that he's got together with some of our help and some of the help from the Psychedelic Science Funding Collaborative, $10 million matching grant. But it's only a challenge grant. We have to raise 10 million in order to get the 10 million. But because we've already raised an initial 10 million, we'll then have 30 million, and that will be the entire capstone campaign, which will be just this amazing, amazing situation, because then it'll set us up to get approval in these 3 countries. After that, we will try to raise another $30 million, not from investors, to globalize MDMA. But we now have this deadline, September 10th, where we have to raise this 10 million. We've got about 2.75 million so far from over 1,500 people. Any amount is appreciated, will be doubled, and it will. So the capstone campaign and the capstone challenge are what we're really focused on right now, and it would be the culmination of this 34 years of MAPS's history, and give us the resources necessary to make MDMA into a medicine, but also eventually, we hope, go to other indications of MDMA, go to group therapy, ease people's minds and move towards legalization, and then also set the groundwork for us to take it all over the world.